December 17th, 1944. Deep in the frozen Ardennes forest of Belgium, a German officer named Hans Müller huddled in his foxhole, scribbling desperate words into his diary, words that would haunt him forever. "The Americans are nothing like the Russians," he wrote, his hands shaking. "Their artillery is something completely different. It's not just the volume of fire, though that alone is terrifying. It's the speed, the precision, the horrifying reality that you have zero time to react. 1 second there's silence, the next second your entire world explodes." That morning, through the thick fog, Müller had witnessed something that would shatter every assumption German soldiers held about American military power. His battalion, part of the elite 6th SS Panzer Army, had just launched Hitler's final desperate gamble in the West. They'd achieved total surprise against the thinly defended American positions. Victory seemed within their grasp. Then the American artillery found them. What Müller didn't know, what no German soldier advancing through those snow-covered forests could have possibly known, was that they were about to face the most lethal artillery system ever created in human history. A system so advanced, so devastating, and so precisely coordinated that it would break the back of Germany's last offensive and reveal the true depth of American military dominance.
The collapse had actually begun long before the Battle of the Bulge. Throughout 1943 and 1944, German veterans were being transferred from the brutal Eastern Front to face American forces in Italy, France, and the Low Countries. These were hardened soldiers who brought with them assumptions forged in desperate life-or-death battles against Soviet artillery. They thought they knew how to survive artillery bombardments. Against the Russians, they'd learned the patterns. The Soviets would fire ranging shots first, giving German troops precious seconds to dive for cover. The shells would arrive in predictable sequences, allowing smart soldiers to move between barrages. Fire direction was slow, often taking 10 to 15 minutes from observation to actual impact. The Americans? They were completely different, terrifyingly different. Hauptmann Otto Schmidt was a 2-year veteran of the Eastern Front who'd been captured with the Afrika Korps in Tunisia in May 1943. Years later, in a post-war interview, he described his first encounter with American artillery, and you can hear the shock still in his voice.
"We'd taken position in a wadi north of Tunis," Schmidt recalled. "Good cover, we thought. Against the Russians, they would have needed an hour just to find us, then another hour to range their guns properly. We felt safe enough to heat our morning coffee. Then we saw it. A small aircraft, no bigger than a reconnaissance plane, puttering overhead at maybe 500 meters altitude. We barely paid it any attention. Such aircraft carried no weapons. We assumed it was just doing photography work." Here's where Schmidt's voice drops to almost a whisper in the recording. 3 minutes later, without warning, without ranging shots, without any indication whatsoever, the entire wadi just erupted. Shells landing simultaneously, not in sequence like we were used to. Airbursts above us, ground bursts among us. In 30 seconds, my entire company ceased to exist as a fighting unit. He pauses. I was one of 11 survivors out of 123 men.
That small aircraft Schmidt had seen was an L-4 Grasshopper, basically a modified Piper Cub serving as the American Forward Observer's flying platform. These humble, unarmed little planes would become the most feared aircraft in the entire German military, not because of any weapons they carried, but because of what inevitably followed their appearance. German soldiers learned a bitter, brutal truth. When you saw a grasshopper overhead, you had minutes, maybe only seconds, before American artillery would turn your position into a killing ground. Lieutenant Friedrich Bauer was an artillery officer who'd coordinated counter-battery fire on the Eastern Front. He documented his complete astonishment in letters that were discovered decades later in German military archives. He wrote, "I studied captured American artillery procedures from documents we'd taken. Initially, I believed these documents had to be deception, propaganda designed to intimidate us. No artillery system could possibly perform as described. The level of coordination required would be completely impossible." Then came the moment that changed everything. He wrote, "Near St. Omer, an American grasshopper appeared. We tracked it, preparing to displace our guns as standard procedure demanded. But before we could even move, before we had even computed firing data for our own counter-battery fire, American shells were landing directly on our gun positions."
Bauer continues, "This wasn't random fire or area saturation. This was precise fire on each individual gun. They had calculated firing solutions, coordinated multiple batteries at completely different ranges, and delivered simultaneous fire in less time than it took our own forward observers just to radio map coordinates back to our fire direction center." Picture this. In offices across the United States, rooms full of women worked around the clock with mechanical calculators, slide rules, and logarithm tables. Their job? Computing firing solutions for every conceivable combination of variables. Wind speed and direction, temperature, humidity, barrel wear, propellant temperature, altitude differences between gun and target. Every possible factor. These calculations, representing thousands of hours of computational work, were printed in books small enough to fit in a map case. This allowed American fire direction officers to calculate precise firing solutions in minutes rather than hours. They didn't have to do the math in the field. Someone had already done it for them back home. Hauptmann Werner Hoffmann was a mathematics professor who'd been conscripted into Wehrmacht artillery. After the war, he examined captured American firing tables, and his analysis, preserved in German military records, reveals his stunned appreciation. These tables represent years of computational work, thousands upon thousands of hours on mechanical calculators. They had computed solutions for every variable we might possibly encounter in the field. Our own firing tables were crude by comparison, requiring extensive field calculations for each individual mission. The Americans had done all the mathematics in advance. In the field, they simply looked up the answer. But even these incredible firing tables couldn't fully explain the devastating effectiveness of American artillery. The true revolution was something called time on target, universally known by its abbreviation TOT. Time on target coordinated artillery fire so that shells from multiple batteries fired at different times based on their distance from the target would all arrive simultaneously within a 3-second window. Let that sink in for a moment. Shells fired from guns miles apart at different times, all landing at the exact same moment. The effect on German soldiers was absolutely catastrophic. There was no warning, no ranging shots, no gradual buildup of fire. One instant complete silence, the next instant dozens of shells detonating simultaneously across your position. German troops in the open, whose survival against conventional artillery depended entirely on dropping prone at the first explosion, had absolutely no time to react. Studies conducted after the war revealed a chilling statistic. 66% of artillery casualties occurred in the first few seconds of a barrage. Time on target maximized casualties by completely eliminating any warning. Stabs Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann survived multiple TOT strikes during the Battle of the Bulge. His diary was discovered by American forces in a captured command post, and his words paint a vivid picture of absolute terror. It is not artillery as we understand it. It is something entirely new, something we were never trained for. You hear nothing. Then the world ends. Every single shell arrives in the same second. The air bursts kill men who would survive ground bursts. The ground bursts kill men who would survive air bursts. There is no time to dive for cover, no time to reach a foxhole, no time even to drop flat on the ground. You are simply alive one moment and wounded or dead the next. The sheer speed of American artillery response left German commanders in shock. German artillery, which was considered among the best in the world, could deliver fire in 8 to 10 minutes under ideal conditions. American artillery, they routinely delivered accurate fire in 3 minutes, sometimes even faster.
This incredible speed came from multiple technological advantages working together. American forward observers used brand new FM radios that provided crystal clear, static-free communication. German forces were still relying primarily on AM radios, plagued by constant interference and poor quality. But it wasn't just better radios. American radios were far more numerous. Every single infantry battalion had multiple radio-equipped forward observers. German battalions? They typically had 1 or 2 radios, often shared between multiple units. The forward observers themselves represented another massive American advantage. German forward observers were artillery officers who often lacked infantry training or real combat experience with ground troops. American forward observers were specially trained personnel who understood both artillery and infantry tactics, inside and out. They moved with infantry units. They lived with infantry soldiers. They coordinated fire as a fully integrated part of combined arms operations. And here's the kicker. American artillery observers could call upon an entire corps' worth of artillery, not just their own battalion. The system allowed a single forward observer, maybe just a lieutenant, to coordinate fire from dozens of batteries within minutes. Think about that. A junior officer calling for fire support could bring down the equivalent weight of metal of a small airstrike, delivered more accurately and more rapidly than any air support could possibly provide. Oberst Heinrich Müller commanded an infantry regiment that was completely destroyed near St. Lo in July 1944. In his final report, he documented this capability with a sense of disbelief. A single American infantry company, surrounded in a small village, held my entire regiment at bay for 6 hours. Every single time we attempted to assault their position, artillery fire drove us back, not from one battery, but from what seemed like dozens of batteries firing in perfect coordination. The forward observer with that company, probably just a lieutenant or captain, commanded more firepower than I could bring to bear with my entire regimental artillery. We lost 400 men attempting to overrun 120 Americans. We failed completely. This wasn't just about having good equipment. This was about a fundamental transformation in how warfare was conducted. The artillery pieces themselves demonstrated American industrial superiority in stunning fashion. The M2A1 105mm howitzer was the standard American light artillery piece, and it was an absolute marvel of engineering and mass manufacturing.
Rock Island Arsenal had perfected production techniques that allowed them to manufacture these guns rapidly while maintaining incredibly precise tolerances. By the end of World War II, the United States had produced 8,536 M2A1 howitzers. Each American infantry division had 36 of these howitzers, organized into 3 battalions of 12 guns each. And here's what made them truly deadly. These battalions were fully motorized. They were towed by trucks or half-tracks that could move at highway speeds, displacing from one firing position to another, an evolution that took German horse-drawn artillery 2 to 3 hours, took American motorized batteries just 20 to 30 minutes. 20 to 30 minutes versus 2 to 3 hours. Let that sink in.
The contrast in mobility was absolutely stark, and it reveals something shocking about the German military that Nazi propaganda desperately tried to hide. Despite all those propaganda films showing mechanized panzer divisions, approximately 80% of German motive power still relied on horses for transport. Horses, in the 1940s, fighting a modern war. Germany started World War II with 514,000 horses. By February 1945, they had 1,198,000 horses in military service. Each German artillery piece required 6 to 8 horses and took hours to limber up, move, and set up again. In winter conditions, movement became nearly impossible. Gefreiter Paul Richter was assigned to a German artillery battery in Normandy, and he kept a detailed diary that survived the war. Listen to the despair in his words. "We watched American artillery displace during an active battle. They fired their mission, then trucks appeared like magic. Within 20 minutes, the entire battery had packed up their guns and departed. We required 2 hours minimum to perform the same evolution, and that assumed good weather and decent roads. In mud or under fire, we might need 4 hours or more." Richter continues, and you can feel his growing hopelessness. The Americans would set up at a new position and be ready to fire again before we had even finished moving from our old position. We were fighting a 19th century war with horses against an enemy fighting a 20th century war with trucks. The outcome was inevitable from the start. But wait, it gets even more devastating. The American 155mm howitzers provided even heavier fire support. Each division had 12 M1 155mm howitzers in a separate battalion. These monsters fired 95-pound shells to ranges exceeding 14,000 meters. They could destroy fortifications that would easily survive smaller caliber fire. The 155 itself was a triumph of engineering. Designed in the late 1930s and standardized in May 1941, it combined incredible range, pinpoint accuracy, and rock-solid reliability. The United States produced over 10,000 of these guns during the war. The gun could be towed at highway speeds by a truck or half-track, allowing rapid displacement just like the smaller howitzers. The rate of fire was 4 rounds per minute, though well-trained crews could briefly achieve 6 rounds per minute. But even these divisional assets paled in comparison to the artillery available at Corps and Army level. American Corps artillery typically included battalions of 155mm guns, 8-inch howitzers, and even massive 240mm howitzers. These weapons, capable of destroying literally any fortification, could be called upon by forward observers at the battalion level. The pyramiding of firepower was absolutely insane. A single rifle company could, within just minutes, bring down fire from divisional, corps, and even army artillery, all coordinated, all precise, all devastating. German artillery, by contrast, was rigidly organized. Corps and Army artillery were completely separate commands, not available to support divisional operations without extensive coordination and approval through multiple headquarters. German infantry divisions had their own artillery, sure, but calling fire from Corps artillery required routing requests from division up to Corps, often taking hours for approval.
By the time fire arrived, if it arrived at all, American mobile warfare had already moved the front line miles away. Lieutenant Joachim Weber was a forward observer who requested Corps artillery support during the Normandy campaign. His documented frustration tells the story perfectly. "I called for Corps artillery at 0915 hours. The enemy was massing tanks for a major assault on our position. I provided exact coordinates, described the target in detail, explained the entire tactical situation. At 1330 hours, 4 hours later, I finally received fire. 3 salvos, just 3. By that time, the American tanks had already completed their attack and withdrawn. Our position was overrun. I survived only by sheer luck." He ends with bitter resignation. The Corps artillery, which might have saved us and our position, arrived too late to matter at all. The technical sophistication of American artillery extended even to the ammunition itself. While Germany struggled with propellant shortages and wildly inconsistent shell production, American industry delivered ammunition in seemingly unlimited quantities, manufactured to precise specifications that ensured consistent performance every single time. But the Americans had one more trick up their sleeve. A technological marvel that would prove absolutely decisive: the VT fuse. The VT fuse, also called the proximity fuse, was genuinely revolutionary. It contained a miniature radar transmitter and receiver built right into the nose of the artillery shell. The transmitter would broadcast a radio signal as the shell flew through the air. When the shell approached the ground or any object, the reflected signal would trigger detonation automatically. The result? A shell that exploded at the optimal height for maximum lethality, typically 10 to 20 meters above the ground, every single time, perfectly. The VT fuse completely transformed artillery effectiveness. You see, conventional time fuses required calculating the precise time to target, then manually setting the fuse accordingly. But wind, temperature, barrel wear, all of these affected shell flight time. Even small errors meant shells either exploding too high to be effective or burying themselves in the ground before detonation. The VT fuse eliminated all these variables completely, guaranteeing optimal airburst regardless of conditions. The VT fuse had first been used in combat by the USS Helena on January 5, 1943, shooting down a Japanese dive bomber off Guadalcanal with only 2 to 3 salvos. Throughout 1943 and 1944, VT fuses proved devastatingly effective in naval anti-aircraft operations and against German V-1 flying bombs over England. However, there was one massive concern: the technology falling into German hands. This prevented its use in ground artillery over Europe for over a year. General Dwight Eisenhower personally requested permission to employ VT fuses during the Battle of the Bulge, arguing passionately that their effectiveness justified the security risk. The Pentagon initially refused, but Eisenhower protested vehemently, and formal authorization finally came through on December 19th to 21st, 1944, shortly after the German offensive had begun. This marked the very first use of VT fuses against ground troops in the European theater. The decision proved absolutely correct. VT fuses absolutely devastated German formations caught in the open during the Ardennes offensive. The statistics are almost unbelievable. Naval anti-aircraft tests had shown VT fuses were 3 to 4 times more effective than conventional fuses. Against V-1 flying bombs, VT fuses destroyed 79% of all incoming targets. The lethal fragment area was 3,000 square feet versus just 60 square feet for conventional fuses. Some estimates suggested VT fuses increased overall artillery effectiveness by 200 to 700%. That's not a typo, 700% increase. German troops who had learned to survive conventional artillery by seeking any depression in the ground, any small cover, discovered that VT fuses completely negated such protection.
The shells exploded above them, showering downward with deadly fragments that struck men lying prone in shallow foxholes. Obergefreiter Hans Müller, whose diary opened our story, survived a VT fuse barrage and recorded his experience. We had learned on the Eastern Front to go flat at the first explosion. Even shallow depressions, small holes in the ground, offered good protection from fragments traveling horizontally. But these shells, and here his handwriting becomes shaky in the diary, these demon shells, as we called them, exploded above us. The fragments came down like deadly rain. Men in foxholes, men who should have been completely protected, were killed by fragments falling vertically. There was no defense except deep bunkers, and we had absolutely no time to dig deep bunkers. We simply died. The psychological impact of VT fuses actually compounded their devastating physical effects. German soldiers, trained their entire military career to respond to artillery by seeking cover, found their training completely irrelevant, useless. The knowledge that no cover short of overhead protection would save them induced a kind of paralysis. Some units outright refused to leave defensive positions, even under direct orders, because movement in the open meant certain death if American artillery engaged them with VT fuses.
Hauptmann Friedrich Bauer documented a near mutiny in his unit during the final weeks of the Ardennes offensive. My company was ordered to attack an American position 300 meters distant. The men refused outright. They had seen with their own eyes what American artillery, especially with these new fuses that burst in air, did to troops in the open. I tried to explain that we would die anyway if we did not attack, that the Americans would eventually overrun our position whether we attacked or not. The men would not move. They preferred the possibility of capture to the absolute certainty of death under American artillery fire. The industrial capacity that produced American artillery and ammunition in such massive quantities represented yet another dimension of superiority that German soldiers simply could not comprehend. Rock Island Arsenal alone produced over 10,000 105mm howitzers. Multiple other factories produced 155mm howitzers and even heavier weapons. Shell production reached absolutely staggering levels throughout the entire war. German production, hampered by relentless Allied bombing, critical resource shortages, and wildly inefficient allocation of industrial capacity, never even came close to approaching American production levels. Here's the kicker. German artillery pieces were often superior in design to their American counterparts. German engineering was excellent. But Germany produced them in completely insufficient numbers and lacked the industrial capacity to maintain production as the war dragged on. By 1944, German artillery batteries were often operating at half strength, with guns destroyed or worn out and absolutely no replacements available anywhere. More critically, German ammunition production simply could not sustain intensive operations. German artillery batteries were often limited to minimal daily allowances, sometimes as few as 2 to 3 shells per gun per day. 2 to 3 shells. American batteries faced no such restrictions whatsoever. Forward observers could call for fire freely, knowing that ammunition supply was effectively unlimited. If you needed 100 shells, you got 100 shells. If you needed 1,000, you got 1,000.
Lieutenant Werner Vogel was a German artillery officer who documented the ammunition crisis in his war diary with growing desperation. We received 50 shells per gun for an entire week, 50 shells total to support an infantry regiment facing continuous American attacks. I was required to justify each individual fire mission to battalion headquarters, explaining in detail why this particular target merited the expenditure of irreplaceable ammunition. Meanwhile, and you can hear his bitterness, American artillery fired thousands of shells daily with no apparent concern whatsoever for conservation. We were fighting a poor man's war against a rich man's enemy. The disparity in ammunition supply manifested directly in tactical doctrine, in how battles were actually fought. German artillery doctrine emphasized concentrated mass fire on high-value targets delivered only after careful planning and approval from higher command. American doctrine emphasized responsive fire, immediately available to support infantry operations whenever and wherever needed. An American infantry platoon leader could request artillery support within 3 minutes. A German platoon leader might wait hours for fire if he received any support at all. The logistics of ammunition supply further highlighted overwhelming American advantages. American artillery was fully motorized, supplied by massive truck convoys that could deliver thousands of shells to forward positions within hours of request. German artillery, still horse-drawn and often dependent on increasingly vulnerable rail transport for long-distance movement, struggled desperately to maintain even adequate forward stocks. As Allied air power systematically interdicted German rail networks, bombing every junction and marshalling yard, ammunition supply became increasingly difficult, then nearly impossible. American logistics also benefited enormously from standardization. The M1 shell fired by 105mm howitzers used the exact same fuse as shells fired by 155mm and even larger calibers. This standardization simplified supply chains, reduced inventory requirements, and ensured that fuses were always available when needed. German ammunition production, plagued by multiple competing fuse designs and numerous caliber variants, suffered chronic shortages of specific components, even when overall production numbers remained theoretically adequate.
The overwhelming superiority of American artillery created a cascading effect on German tactical options, essentially trapping German commanders in an impossible situation. German commanders, knowing full well that massing forces would immediately draw devastating artillery fire, were forced to disperse their units widely. But dispersed units lacked combat power and could be defeated piecemeal by smaller American forces. On the other hand, concentrated forces could generate real combat power and mount effective attacks, but immediately became priority targets for American artillery. Either choice led inevitably to defeat. It was a tactical trap with no escape. The Ardennes offensive, Germany's final major attack in the West, demonstrated these brutal dynamics with absolute clarity. German planning depended entirely on fog and overcast weather to neutralize American air power. The planners had correctly assessed that American aircraft could not effectively operate in terrible weather. But they completely failed to understand one critical fact. American artillery did not require good weather to operate at peak effectiveness. During the opening days of the offensive, German armored and infantry divisions achieved genuinely significant penetrations against surprised American forces. Over 200,000 German troops and approximately 1,000 tanks launched the initial assault on December 16, 1944. For a brief moment, Hitler's gamble seemed to be working. Then American artillery found them. German horse-drawn artillery batteries, lacking the mobility to rapidly displace when taken under heavy fire, were systematically destroyed in place. German guns, lacking adequate ammunition reserves to engage in sustained counter-battery fire, fell silent one by one, while American guns continued to fire without pause.
Zimmerman continues, "We fired one mission in support of our advancing infantry. Within 10 minutes, American counter-battery fire destroyed 3 of our 6 guns and killed most of our horses. We attempted to displace the remaining guns, but we lacked sufficient horses to move them. We had no choice but to abandon the guns and withdraw on foot." This was the pattern across the entire front. Our artillery was systematically silenced, while American artillery continued to fire, without any pause whatsoever. Interestingly, even American artillery faced temporary challenges. At Bastogne, American artillery ammunition was actually restricted to only 10 rounds per gun per day on December 22nd due to supply shortages caused by the surprise attack. Despite this severe constraint, American artillery still proved absolutely decisive in breaking repeated German attacks around the surrounded town. When the weather finally cleared after Christmas, resupply resumed in force, and American artillery fire intensified dramatically to levels the Germans had never experienced. During the entire Bulge campaign, 4,155 American artillery pieces fired an almost incomprehensible 1,255,000 artillery rounds, more than 1 million shells. German units that had penetrated 50 kilometers into American lines found themselves trapped, completely surrounded by American forces that could call upon unlimited artillery support once resupply operations fully resumed. Oberst Heinrich Müller, whose regiment had been destroyed at St. Lo 6 months earlier, now commanded a replacement regiment during the Bulge. His final report, written in a prisoner of war camp after his capture in January 1945, provides a brutally stark assessment. We were defeated by American artillery before we were ever defeated by American infantry or armor. Every movement we made was observed by their aircraft and immediately engaged by their artillery. Every concentration of forces was broken up by artillery fire before we could even launch an attack. Every defensive position was smashed by artillery fire before their infantry even began their assault.
Müller's words become even more devastating. We could not move. We could not mass our forces. We could not defend effectively. We simply absorbed artillery fire continuously until we ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The offensive, which had been planned to drive all the way through to Antwerp and split the Allied armies in half, stalled after less than a week. It was broken primarily by American artillery, not tanks or infantry. German units that began the offensive at full strength ended it with 30 to 40% casualties, with artillery fire accounting for the overwhelming majority of those losses. The lessons learned by German soldiers who survived encounters with American artillery came far too late to change the war's outcome. Those who were captured and sent to prisoner of war camps in the United States discovered something even more demoralizing. The artillery system that had destroyed their units represented just one aspect of American military capability. The same industrial capacity that produced tens of thousands of artillery pieces and millions of shells was simultaneously producing tanks, aircraft, trucks, and every other implement of modern war in quantities that absolutely dwarfed German production. Gefreiter Otto Schmidt, captured in Tunisia and held at a POW camp in Texas, wrote in a letter that somehow passed American censors, "I have seen American industry with my own eyes. I have watched trains carrying artillery pieces, hundreds of them, moving continuously toward ports for shipment overseas. I have seen factories producing shells by the thousands every single day. The Americans defeated us not through superior tactics or superior soldiers, though their tactics were undeniably good and their soldiers genuinely brave. They defeated us through sheer industrial might. They could afford to fire 100 shells where we could fire 1. They could afford to lose equipment and replace it within days. We could not match this. We could never match this, no matter how long we fought or how hard we tried." German prisoners of war who witnessed American artillery training exercises in the United States saw firsthand the incredible professionalism and preparation that made the entire system so devastatingly effective.
American artillery crews trained constantly, endlessly practicing the coordination and communication that allowed time-on-target missions to work flawlessly. Forward observers worked closely with infantry units, day after day, practicing the seamless integration that made American combined arms operations so brutally effective. Lieutenant Friedrich Bauer, the artillery officer who'd been captured in Italy, attended lectures at a prisoner of war camp, where American artillery officers openly explained their methods. His notes, preserved in German archives, reveal his professional admiration mixed with despair. They have systematized everything that we did through individual skill and personal initiative. Where we depended on talented artillery officers computing firing solutions through hard-won experience and mathematical calculation, they created comprehensive tables that allow even average officers to achieve the same results consistently. Bauer continues, where we depended on highly skilled radio operators maintaining communication under extremely difficult conditions. They produced radios so reliable and easy to use that even minimally trained operators could maintain perfect contact. They have taken the art of artillery and transformed it into an industrial process, endlessly repeatable and infinitely scalable. This is the true secret of their success. The transformation of German prisoners extended far beyond mere technical appreciation. Many of these soldiers realized, often with a sense of shock, that German propaganda about American military weakness had been completely, utterly false. The Americans they encountered, both as enemies on the battlefield and later as captors in prison camps, demonstrated professional competence, industrial capability, and organizational skill that exceeded German capabilities in nearly every single dimension. Obergefreiter Hans Müller, whose diary has chronicled his experiences throughout the Ardennes, was captured during the final collapse of the German offensive.
His later diary entries, written in a prisoner of war camp with time for reflection, show a complete reversal of his earlier beliefs. We were told repeatedly that the Americans were inferior soldiers, that they lacked fighting spirit and warrior culture, that they depended purely on material superiority because they lacked the skill and courage of German soldiers. These were lies, complete lies. American soldiers fought with tremendous courage and undeniable skill, but they also fought with overwhelming material advantages that German courage and skill simply could not overcome. Most significantly, they fought with an artillery system so incredibly advanced that we had absolutely no effective counter. This, more than any other single factor, defeated us. By early 1945, as Germany's situation became utterly hopeless, American artillery superiority only continued to increase. German ammunition production collapsed entirely under relentless Allied bombing. German artillery units lost their experienced crews to casualties and received woefully inadequate replacements, often teenagers with minimal training. German horses, still absolutely essential for moving artillery, died by the thousands from overwork, lack of fodder, and constant American fire. German batteries that had operated with 6 guns at the war's beginning were now operating with just 2 or 3 functional guns. Some divisions had no functional artillery whatsoever. American artillery, by stark contrast, only grew stronger. Production continued to accelerate even as the war in Europe approached its inevitable end. American factories actually produced more artillery pieces in 1944 than in any previous year of the war. Ammunition production reached levels that allowed American forces to fire without any restriction whatsoever. New technologies, including improved fire direction computers and even better radios, enhanced effectiveness even further.
The end came in May 1945 with Germany's unconditional surrender. In the final battles, American artillery demonstrated capabilities that would have seemed completely impossible just a few years earlier. Single battalions could deliver absolutely overwhelming firepower on demand. Multiple corps' worth of artillery could coordinate fire on area targets, literally saturating entire map grid squares with shells. Forward observers could call down total destruction on any target within minutes, completely confident that accurate, devastating fire would arrive quickly. German survivors of these final battles carried with them a profound, almost fearful respect for American artillery. Hauptmann Werner Hoffmann, the mathematics professor who had analyzed American firing tables with such academic interest, was captured in the Ruhr Pocket in April 1945. His final military report, written specifically for American intelligence officers, provided a professional analysis of American artillery effectiveness. The American artillery system represents the absolute culmination of industrial-age warfare. They have applied pure industrial methods, mass production, rigorous standardization, and systematic training to create a weapon system of truly unprecedented effectiveness. Individual German artillery pieces may be superior in technical design. Individual German artillery officers may match American officers in personal skill and tactical knowledge. But the Americans have created a system that does not depend whatsoever on individual superiority. Their system produces consistent, overwhelming, and rapidly delivered firepower regardless of individual skill levels. This systematization represents a genuine revolution in warfare that Germany never matched, and given our industrial limitations, could never have matched. In the decades following the war, historians analyzing American military effectiveness in World War II consistently identified artillery as perhaps the single most important advantage American forces possessed over their German adversaries. While tanks and aircraft received enormous public attention, appearing on propaganda posters and in newsreels, it was artillery that actually broke German attacks, supported American advances, and inflicted the majority of casualties in the Western theater. German military professionals, studying their comprehensive defeat after the war with typical German thoroughness, consistently identified American artillery superiority as the most decisive factor in their loss. General Franz Halder, former chief of the German General Staff, wrote in his detailed post-war analysis, "American artillery achieved what we believed was fundamentally impossible. They transformed artillery from a supporting arm into a truly dominant weapon system. Their coordination, their fire control, their logistics, and their industrial production created an artillery force that simply could not be matched or effectively countered. German forces in the West operated under constant artillery threat, unable to mass forces without drawing devastating fire, unable to move without immediate observation, unable to fight effectively under the relentless weight of American shells. The tactical innovations developed by American artillery forces during World War II became the very foundation for modern artillery doctrine worldwide. Time on target remains the standard method for coordinating artillery fires in every modern military. Fire direction centers remain the central hub of artillery operations globally. Forward observers, closely integrated with maneuver forces, remain absolutely essential for delivering responsive fire support. The basic organizational structure established by the United States in World War II persists in military forces around the world to this very day. The proximity fuse represented such a significant technological advance that its full impact and technical details remained classified for many years after the war ended. The combination of psychological impact and physical casualties often broke unit cohesion entirely. German soldiers caught in the open by VT-fused shells had absolutely no effective defense, none whatsoever. For the German soldiers who faced American artillery and somehow survived,
The experience left permanent, haunting impressions. Stabsfeldwebel Kurt Zimmermann, who survived multiple devastating tote barrages during the Battle of the Bulge, immigrated to the United States in the 1950s. In a 1960 interview, decades after the war, he reflected on his wartime experiences with striking honesty. "I have been asked many times what weapon I feared most during the war. Not tanks, though late-war German tanks were clearly inferior to American armor. Not aircraft, though American air power was absolutely overwhelming. Not even American infantry, though they fought extremely well and with great courage. The weapon I feared most, the weapon that gave me nightmares then and sometimes still gives me nightmares today, was American artillery. The sudden, devastating fire that arrived without any warning whatsoever. The terrible knowledge that you might die without ever even seeing your enemy, killed by shells fired from guns positioned kilometers away, operated by men you would never see." He pauses in the recording, and when he speaks again, his voice is quieter. This was true terror. The story of German soldiers facing American artillery is ultimately a story about the fundamental transformation of warfare in the industrial age. Individual courage and tactical skill remained important, certainly, but they were completely overshadowed by industrial production capacity, systematic training, and organizational efficiency, operating at a scale previously unimaginable. The Americans had created a comprehensive system that amplified the capabilities of average soldiers, making them far more effective than even exceptional German soldiers fighting with inferior systems and wholly inadequate support. The artillery system that broke German forces in World War II was not the product of a single brilliant innovation or one genius inventor. It was the product of systematic analysis, industrial application, comprehensive training programs, and abundant resources all working together seamlessly. It represented American military power at its most effective, using unmatched industrial capacity and organizational skill to create absolutely overwhelming combat power.
For the German soldiers who faced this system in combat, who survived its devastating effectiveness, the experience was genuinely transformative. They had entered the war believing completely in German military superiority, in the invincibility of German arms, and the superiority of German training and tactics. They ended the war with a very different understanding. They had learned that American industrial might and organizational capability had completely surpassed German capabilities in virtually every measurable dimension. They had learned to fear American artillery above all other weapons on the battlefield, because it represented something more than just firepower. It represented the unbridgeable gap between traditional German military methods and America's new industrial approach to warfare. The thunder of American artillery didn't just announce incoming shells, it announced the future of modern warfare itself. A future where industrial capacity, technological innovation, and systematic organization would matter more than individual heroism or tactical brilliance. The German soldiers in those frozen foxholes in the Ardennes learned this lesson the hardest way possible. And their testimony stands as a stark reminder of how completely warfare had been transformed by the industrial age. If you found this deep dive into World War II artillery fascinating, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more detailed historical content. Drop a comment below telling us what aspect of World War II military technology you'd like us to explore next. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.
December 17th, 1944. Deep in the frozen Ardennes forest of Belgium, a German officer named Hans Müller huddled in his foxhole, scribbling desperate words into his diary, words that would haunt him forever. "The Americans are nothing like the Russians," he wrote, his hands shaking. Their artillery is something completely different. It's not just the volume of fire, though that alone is terrifying. It's the speed, the precision, the horrifying reality that you have zero time to react. 1 second there's silence, the next second your entire world explodes. That morning, through the thick fog, Müller had witnessed something that would shatter every assumption German soldiers held about American military power. His battalion, part of the elite 6th SS Panzer Army, had just launched Hitler's final desperate gamble in the West. They'd achieved total surprise against the thinly defended American positions. Victory seemed within their grasp. Then the American artillery found them. What Müller didn't know, what no German soldier advancing through those snow-covered forests could have possibly known, was that they were about to face the most lethal artillery system ever created in human history. A system so advanced, so devastating, and so precisely coordinated that it would break the back of Germany's last offensive and reveal the true depth of American military dominance.